Live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Hello everyone, this is Fox 12 Now. I am Greg Nibbler. We appreciate you joining us. We are live streaming here out of the Fox 12 Oregon newsroom as we do every weekday starting around 1 p.m. going throughout the afternoon. I just want to remind you, we're on our YouTube channel. We're at kptv.com and we're under the Fox 12 Oregon apps that you can find on pretty much any device. Right now we are talking about an aquifer that was discovered in the Cascades, east of Eugene there in the Central Cascades, that is estimated to be 3 times the size of Lake Mead. We're going to get into that and discuss what an aquifer is, how it was discovered, what this could mean, and all of that right now with Leif Karlstrom, U of O earth scientist, who is joining us right now, who is part of this amazing discovery and research that was going on. Leif, thanks for joining us here today. Really appreciate it. And I think to start off, would you mind just giving everybody a basic definition of what an aquifer is, in case they don't know?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. An aquifer we can think of very simply as just a large reservoir of water stored in the ground. It's a water resource. When we turn on our taps, that water comes from somewhere. If you live in the Willamette Valley or in the Deschutes watershed, that water is most likely coming from the Cascades. And so that's the study area that we're focusing on.
Coming from aquifers that are there in the Cascades, those are refilled by, I assume, snow melt, rainwater, all of that, and then filtered through the ground there?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a renewable resource, but it is dependent on there being precipitation and dominantly snowpack in the Cascades. Yeah.
And can you tell us about your study and how you came about, going about this study that ended up discovering this particular aquifer?
Yeah. So actually, it's a bit of a circuitous story in some sense. I'm a volcanologist normally, so I study how volcanoes work, how they repave the landscape, and of course, the Cascade Mountains are a volcanic mountain range. And so in studying the long-term history of these volcanoes, we sort of realized that there's potential to use the type of data that we use to study volcanoes to inform groundwater resources. And so it's sort of an indirect way towards this science goal. But once we realized that we could learn something new and we had a new tool to probe the dynamics and size of this reservoir, that led us to where we are now.
Is there something particular about volcanic mountain ranges and volcanoes in general that lend themselves to be more prone to aquifers and bigger aquifers like this?
Yeah, so it's the geologic properties of the rocks, right? Their fracture density, their porosity, these sorts of things that determine how much water can be stored underground, and then how fast that water can move when it's stored there. And especially relatively recently erupted lavas, and by relative I mean in the last million years or so. So we call that young, geologically speaking. Those rocks tend to be very highly fractured and highly permeable, and so make great aquifers. Yeah.
And so when that water's flowing through there, I mentioned it earlier, but I mean that's filtering that water. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I mean, there is a pathway that generally takes. And we actually have some constraints on this because this I'm not the first one to study this by any means, right? So this groundwater system has been studied by others, and we estimate that it takes anywhere from sort of 7 to 10 years upwards to greater than 1,000 years for water to pass from the recharge zone up high to springs and streams down below where we measure it.
So saying that, yeah, that snowpack there at the top of the Cascades, just for an example, for that to filter through down to those springs and some of those streams that we're used to seeing, anywhere from 7 years to 1,000 years, is that correct?
Or more. We can think about the pathway that a water particle takes as highly dependent on where it enters and then the structure of the rocks, right? So some water particles transit the system very rapidly, others take a much longer route. And so it's many of those together that make up the water that we see. And
tell us about this particular aquifer, the study of, I guess, how you went about discovering this.
Yeah, well, so first I should say that we didn't discover this aquifer, first of all. So it's been around. In fact, the estimate related to Lake Mead has been posed before.
Okay.
But we're expanding this considerably. I think previously the number was about 1 times the size of Lake Mead, or in absolute numbers, that's about 30 cubic kilometers metric system, I suppose. But what we did is we're able to use old exploration drill holes primarily to make this new estimate that in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of interest in geothermal in the Cascades. And so there was a whole sequence of drill holes that were drilled, some of them quite deeply, over a kilometer. And those fingerprint the active groundwater system because the temperatures that they discovered in those drill holes were essentially constant. So normally you expect rocks to heat up as you get deeper into the earth, and this just wasn't the case for the Cascades. And in fact, as you drill deeper, sometimes the temperature went down, got colder, which seems very strange. But you can explain that through the movement of heat by groundwater. And so when you see these sort of unusual temperature profiles in the drill holes, that's a fingerprint for actively circulating groundwater. And so we sort of interpolated, we sort of combined all these drill holes to get a sense of the volume that's involved here. And
so you were able to do that and correlate all of that data and then determine that this could be up to this size.
Yeah, and I should say, we've tried to be pretty conservative with this estimate. So it could be larger, but it's considerably larger, at least 3 times the size that it was previously estimated as. So quite a bit of water sitting up there at the top of the mountain range. It's like a big water tower.
I was just going to ask, so this is at the top of the range, and so it's sitting up there and then is filtering down to some of the streams and springs below that.
That's right.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty exciting to be able to correlate all that data and use some of that, some of these things that were utilized before, but repurpose them to essentially, or just take the data from them that's already there and be able to figure this out. So when you think about this, an aquifer maybe 3 times the size of Lake Mead, we'll just use that because it's a good reference for people. But what are the ramifications of understanding how big this aquifer I'll rephrase that. What are the ramifications of understanding how big this aquifer is for people as far as the use of groundwater?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess both sides of the Cascade crest, we rely on this water resource, right? It's the water that's supplying the city of Eugene, where I live. Also in Bends, right? Both sides of the Cascade crest, the Deschutes and the McKinsey and Willamette watersheds are dominantly groundwater rivers, meaning that in the summer when it doesn't rain as much, they still have quite high stream flow. And that's telling you something. That's telling you that the supply to those rivers is really buffered by a very large storage reservoir up high. And so that, on the one hand, that's a great thing, right? It means that we have lots of water, and that's something that we've gotten used to. But it's also a thing that we should be aware of, right? That it is a finite resource, and the fact is that snowpack is declining in the Cascades. And so there's actually the potential that this resource may change over time. It's not been well studied, and so that's maybe one of the things that I'd highlight with this new work, is that we're really sort of identifying a place for future investigations, that we really need to understand the resilience of this large aquifer in the face of climate change and other water usage.
Yeah, and just to reiterate too, to explain that for everybody. So you mentioned that that the declining snowpack. So that's something that has been documented. The snowpack is declining year over year. Is there any kind of estimation on how that could affect the groundwater and the aquifers, I guess, going forward? Like, are we talking about 1,000 years? Or are we talking 10 years? Or any kind of understanding of that?
Well, I can't answer that question for you now, but I will say that there has been, we've had a couple of natural experiments. For example, 2015 was a very low precipitation year, and it has been used as actually a model or a test case for climate change. And what's interesting about 2015 is that we had little or no snowpack in the Cascades then, and yet the stream flow, the response of the system, didn't change all that much. And so that's telling you that the response time of this large aquifer is greater than a year. So it's not going to take one bad year, but we don't know what will happen if we get 10 bad years or 100 bad years. And so that's the next steps in this research.
Right, measuring that over time just to figure that out. And and looking at the research now. So now that you've gotten this far with this, what are the next steps as far as what you're doing with your team in analyzing all this data?
Yeah, well, I should say I'll sort of circle back to what I started with, which is that we started with an interest in the sort of the deep origins of this landscape. And so the water is a part of that. But really, I guess it's for anyone who is interested in the origin of the Cascades and why the volcanic landscape looks the way it does and why it transitions to this sort of amazing ridge and valley topography that we see in the Western Cascades. And all told, that's a sort of integrated area in earth science called the critical zone. That's sort of weathering and erosion and groundwater and volcanism in this case. And so my research group is really interested in how all those factors play together, that we have magma that's building the landscape over long time periods and water that's eroding it. And so really kind of building a better picture for this, using a variety of techniques. Yeah.
Has the increase in use of different kinds of technology been able to help you, further this study as far as, I don't know, mapping underneath the ground and understanding what's actually happening there?
Yeah, there's a lot of potential for that. And one in particular to highlight is the use of electromagnetic surveys. So this is a great possibility going forward. We hope that this is something that either our team or someone else will do, because really in order to assess the size and the shape of this groundwater body, you need more than a few isolated drill holes. So there's considerable room for improvement in those estimates. That's why we tried to be quite conservative in our estimates, actually. It's just the sparse nature of available data. So that's going forward. We hope that there's a lot more work using what broadly are called geophysical techniques to map the aquifer.
I love that. Yeah, the more that, those tools are available for you to help figure that out. And as you mentioned, just understand the entire system, the Cascades themselves, and just how that affects everybody in every aspect of life. Essentially, we're affected by that. Anything else that you think is important for people to know just about the study and what you came out with this?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing to reflect on, that we have this massive water tower stored at the top of the mountains. It's a natural water tower. It's a bit hidden from view, right? But I think we get used to that living in Oregon. We have this water supply, and I think the thing to highlight is that that water is coming from somewhere and lives somewhere and has a residence time and, is not an indefinite resource. And so it's just something to be aware of and learn more about.
Yeah, to really concentrate on it. I think, and one more time, just to reiterate something that you did say earlier, how long, generally speaking, or what can people understand as far as the snowpack there at the top, on how long it takes for that to filter down to where it's something that, say, they could be drinking a glass of water of in Eugene?
Well, I think the common residence time that has been measured for water in this aquifer is roughly 10 years. So we could think about that as the lag time between, a snow particle melting at the top of the Cascades and water popping out in the spring in the McKinsey, for example.
So just an estimate, but it still could be 1 year or 1,000 years, depending on where it's coming from, too. So
that's right.
Well, Leif, thank you very much. This is a really fascinating study. I'm looking forward to finding out, more what you and your team and everybody else is doing to give us all this better understanding of the natural environment that's around us and where our water comes from, to understand it, and for future generations too, to know, what needs to be taken into account and get this better picture. Thanks for being here on Fox 12 Now. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And for everybody watching, this is Fox 12 Now. Oops, wrong button. There we go. See, we're live because I just hit that. But we are live here out of the Fox 12 Oregon newsroom. I appreciate you being here. We're going to take a quick break and talking about volcanology. We're actually going to be talking about an underwater volcano coming up at 2 o'clock. So we're going to be talking about a study for the axial seamount. And I'm going to have the two scientists on who made a prediction that it could erupt in 2025. What does that mean? Well, that's going to be, again, at 2 o'clock. So if you're watching live, come right back to whatever platform you're on. If you're watching afterward, you can find that on our YouTube channel at kptv.com under the Fox 12 Now tab, or on the Fox 12 Oregon apps. And we've got all of our interviews there for you to check out, all the segments, these longer form ones that we get to do with people like Leif, where we get to find out a little bit more and get a bit of an education on some of these important discoveries and things like that. But we'll take a break. I'll talk to you in just a